Laugharne in West Wales, a timeless, mild, beguiling island of a town, according to Dylan Thomas, a place of inspiration and tranquility. But now that peace has been shattered by a row over a building development next to the poet's boathouse. Massive excavations took place without planning permission, prompting anger and protests from locals. They claim the county council has been cowed by the potential consequences of fighting the developer. Many instead place their faith in the town's extraordinary medieval laws to tackle the problem. The row has drawn the attention of a world-famous statesman. Even Dylan Thomas's daughter has hit out at the man behind the development.
I hope he falls over one of his JCBs and ends up at the bottom of the hole that he has created under the cliff.
But the millionaire at the centre of the row claims he's in fact helping the town.
I'm afraid, you can't make omelettes without breaking eggs.
Tonight, Eric Eynon speaks out for the first time. The ancient township of Laugharne in Carmarthenshire is famed for its views, its history, but most of all for the poet who found such inspiration here. Dylan Thomas said he came one day for a day and never left, got off the bus and forgot to get back on again.
He loved small towns by the sea best, and Welsh small towns by the sea best of all. One day he discovered Laugharne, and that was it. In the words of one of his own characters, he had been lost, he said, and had found a dark retreat to shelter from the bullies in the wind.
Dylan Thomas wrote some of his most famous works here, inspired by the teeming nature and stark tranquility of the place. His second house in Laugharne, and the one he loved best, was the boathouse. When the poet lived in the boathouse, the Ferry House next door was just a normal family home. The ferry across the estuary had stopped operating. But in the years since Dylan Thomas's death in 1953, the Ferry House has fallen into disrepair, battered by the same elements that gave life to so much of Dylan's poetry. In 2001, the Ferry House was put up for auction. Eric Eynon, a millionaire local businessman, eagerly snapped it up.
It was a bit of a dream property. My wife and I had lived in Laugharne in the 60s, and of course I'm from this area. Always liked Laugharne and its people, and we were very keen to buy the Ferry House as a very pleasant place to live, and proceeded to buy it. Probably not a good decision in retrospect.
Mr. Eynon was planning to leave his hillside mansion in nearby Pendine and retire to Laugharne. He'd already sold off his caravan park below his home and his ice cream company, Windsor Creamery. It wasn't long before he started work on the Ferry House and surrounding cliff. Some Laugharne residents immediately began to get worried.
We wrote from the trust and said, we're not happy about what's happening. We wrote to the planning department and said, we'd like you to watch this space because Mr. Eynon has a reputation for doing things without asking sometimes.
Indeed, Mr. Eynon was well known to council planners. He'd been served with an enforcement notice over this work on land he owned in Pendine. Near his mansion, he'd also been ordered to remove a holiday chalet he'd built without planning permission. But officials said they couldn't act at Laugharne unless their rules had actually been broken. Then, on Easter weekend, the work on the Ferry House reached a new level. A driveway was excavated and the cliff behind the building torn away.
Because it was a public holiday for Friday, Saturday, Sunday and Monday, there were 4 days when the enforcement officer couldn't come down and stop the work going on. So all this was done without any planning consent whatever.
We didn't think we needed planning permission, actually, not for the work that we were doing. We felt there was dangerous areas of the cliff that needed attention, and we were getting on with it, It wasn't really doing anybody any harm, as far as we were concerned, as far as we felt anyway.
Enforcement officers eventually came to the scene. A stop notice was served, but by then the work was irreversible. Council planners decided that Mr. Eynon should be given a chance to continue the work, fearing that if it was abandoned, the whole cliff could collapse, possibly affecting Dillon's boathouse next door. Mr. Eynon was encouraged to apply for retrospective planning permission.
You can put a house up in anywhere you wish, on the M4, I suppose, provided you would have some difficulty on the M4, but provided you're happy to take it down again if the planners decide that it shouldn't have been built.
In this case, however, because the cliff had been taken away, it could never have been put right, could it?
No, but I think that was a different situation. I mean, the cliff was dangerous and it needed to be taken away.
When the dust settled, locals were shocked to discover that a footpath going down the side of the Ferry House to the beach, filmed here by one of the residents, had been ripped away along with the rest of the cliff and replaced with a private driveway.
Well, it's so special because it was the only place in Laugharne where the local people could actually get access to the water side. Along the other banks of the river, it's deep mud. And people would go down the public footpath and they'd sit or they'd fish or they'd take the children down. And Mr. Eynon made that impossible for all time by literally digging out the footpath and the earth.
It was only after we purchased the property that people suddenly started saying, well, this is a public right-of-way. We obviously were unaware of that. So really, we were not happy about that at all, of course.
So is that why you got rid of it? Or?
No. It was literally to do with the cliff itself, which was right up, as I mentioned earlier, right within inches of the house.
But the issue that incensed locals more than anything else was the use of a narrow track to get access to the building work. Every day, dump trucks and diggers squeezed their way along the same path that Dillon Thomas once walked.
All we're doing is legally travelling along the Queen's Highway. That's what it is. It's a very narrow highway, admittedly, but nevertheless it is the Queen's Highway.
This film of the track was taken in the early 1950s. Back then it was called Cliff Road, later changed to its present name of Dillon's Walk. Locals claim that because it's been used as a footpath for so long, it should be closed off to vehicles like this. Campaigners against the development have also gained the support of one of Eric Eynon's former ice cream salesmen, Carmarthenshire MP Nick Ainger.
I know there are many tourists that visit the boathouse, that walk along Dillon's Walk, and now run the risk of, I won't say injury, but certainly serious inconvenience because vehicles are using what is a very narrow track for access to the boathouse and onto the Ferry House.
We are obviously very, very careful about that, that there should be no problem or no danger to the people using the path.
Mr. Eynon does have another solution, but one that's sure to incense the Laugharne campaigners even more. He wants visitors to get to the boathouse along the beach. It's a plan once considered by the council. They'd even commissioned an artist's impression before the Laugharne Civic Society complained and put a stop to the scheme.
In many respects, I think the council should be looking at perhaps opening that access to the boathouse up. That would certainly relieve a lot of the congestion that sometimes occurs on the road.
The council are again considering the beach route, but if it went ahead, some fear that would play into Mr. Eynon's hands and effectively make Dillon's Walk into a private driveway. Eventually, Eric Eynon's retrospective planning request went before Carmarthenshire County Council. Both he and the campaigners were confident of victory. The locals mounted a protest when councillors visited the site.
He's totally destroyed a natural beauty spot in Laugharne, and he should be made to pay for it.
This is a footpath, not a vehicle access. And I mean, you know, it's a major problem.
I think it's a total disgrace that somebody should come and take the law into his own hands and change things which have been here for such a long time.
Eric Eynon became the target of abuse during the visit, although he tried to keep a low profile.
I'm sorry, I'm not getting involved today, thank you.
There was a few rather vociferous people, and they were rather bolshy, to say the least. But one has to accept that, I suppose, in under the circumstances, perhaps.
He ran the gauntlet of protests as councillors returned to Carmarthen to debate the application. Townspeople were invited to comment.
I was there, I spoke against it. I was invited as a member of the public to address the council, I did. And quite a number of us did. But the whole of the meeting was conducted in English, and we're all English speaking in Laugharne, have been since Norman times. And when it came to a vote, they all started talking Welsh. And the one who was fast asleep, they dug him in the ribs and he put his hand up and voted. And we found we'd lost by one vote. I have personally never seen a planning committee meeting held quite like that. And I've been involved in local government on quite a reasonably high level.
But Laugharne had another weapon, its medieval powers.
To suppress all such vices and misdemeanours as shall be committed in this town.
More in part 2. Laugharne is known as a sleepy coastal town, but even here, local rows can sometimes erupt into violence. In the 90s, it was the scene of the so-called Cockle Wars.
The windscreen was smashed in before another vehicle is said to have been used as a battering ram to force it into the water. It's the latest in a series of incidents which have prompted police patrols. Earlier this week, local residents say tyres were slashed on Cockler's vehicles.
Now, violent scenes were to return. Despite the council decision to back the development next door to Dylan Thomas's boathouse, campaigners against it believed they still had right on their side and became more determined.
Oh, well, there were certain people who were quite difficult. One chap threw a 40-gallon drum over and smashed one of the machines working below, or partly smashed the roof on it. And other vandalism that went on. The roof wasn't improved, certainly, with a few stones that were thrown at it and so on. But, you know, there we are.
It is a tight community, and those who resort to sort of physical anger did, in fact, show their anger by throwing stones at Mr. Eynon's equipment. And though one might not condone the action, one certainly felt sympathetic to what was being done. So he doesn't have friends, many friends in Laugharne.
But it wasn't just Eric Eynon who the campaigners were angry at. They also blamed the council for not taking action.
I mean, the town was astonished. They felt that something very wrong had happened.
It makes me very angry indeed. One thing is the destruction that's gone on. The local authority are meant to support the local population, be interested in what they say. We hear all the time about working with the people. Well, this is an occasion where they simply let us down, betrayed. I don't think is too strong a word for it.
I can't see in planning law why they could not have refused that that retrospective planning application on perfectly reasonable grounds that it was not needed because there was no vehicular access to the property, and insisted that Mr. Eynon restore the wood and the area to what it was, or as best you could, bearing in mind that certain trees have been cut down.
In Carmarthen, councillors and planners were facing a barrage of complaints after giving the development the go-ahead, rather than taking strong action to put things back as they were.
It would have been impossible to get the developer to reinstate the cliff as it was. Work had taken place. In undertaking those works, the developer didn't break any laws. It's not a criminal offence to carry out actions like that without first having planning permission.
If they'd refused planning permission and taken enforcement action, Eric Eynon could have appealed. The site might have been left unfinished for several years. If that had happened, there was the danger that the cliff could have collapsed, possibly threatening Dylan Thomas's boathouse. The council preferred to see the work finished. It seemed Eric Eynon was holding all the cards.
It is not a criminal offence to carry out development without planning permission, and that's the law. Until we have a change in the law, there will always be an opportunity for developers to perhaps take advantage of that particular loophole where they can actually instigate the development, apply retrospectively, and obviously if they refuse they take that risk.
The council still insist that they approved the scheme on its merits rather than any fears they may have had over the cliff, but they concede those fears did affect their decision.
It's probably the weakest part of any planning, of the planning system. It undermines public confidence in the planning process, the ability of local planning authorities to respond, and respond quickly as well. That's an important point.
With the law apparently on the side of the developer, campaigners decided to invoke unique ancient powers granted to the town in the 13th century. George Tremlett holds one of the most powerful positions as the foreman of the Grand Jury of Laugharne.
Laugharne is largely self-governing under a constitution from the 13th century, when the then Norman squire Sir Guy de Brion gave the town to the people.
Despite the passage of the centuries, the ancient ceremonies that surround the corporation remain almost unchanged. Every year, members of the medieval council parade through the streets of Laugharne. Then they invest a new head of the order. The oaths are taken very seriously indeed.
You shall, to the utmost of your skill and knowledge, administer justice without partiality, and also endeavour to suppress all such vices and misdemeanours as shall be committed in this town.
The corporation is headed by the Port Reeve. Other officers are appointed to look after such things as hedgerows and the closing of farm gates at night.
The all-powerful body is the Grand Jury, and that is elected or chosen every October at Big Court Night. And the outgoing jury draws straws, and the one who gets the straw chooses the incoming jury.
So each year the Grand Jury changes, sometimes so does its policy. The corporation owns the road leading to the Ferry House, and in spring last year the then jury put up a bollard, bringing Eric Eynon's work to a halt.
It was put up by the corporation, who are actually the landlord, strangely enough, of Ferry House, because it's leasehold, and it causes a considerable amount of inconvenience.
But then the next jury decided to take the bollard away. But there was to be yet another twist in the tale of Dillon's Walk. Eric Eynon is now considering going to the High Court to ensure that Dillon's Walk is officially classed as a road all the way to the Ferry House. But earlier this month, a new grand jury was elected, and tonight they've been meeting to consider putting up yet another bollard, this time just metres from his driveway. Because of the international fame of Dylan Thomas, by now the whole row was beginning to attract worldwide attention. The former president of America, Jimmy Carter, is one of the most famous Dylan Thomas fans. He's written a letter outlining his concerns about the development. And now Dylan Thomas's daughter, Eronwy, has also entered the fray.
I know what my father would do. He would scarper. He'd go somewhere where they're not spoiling the immediate environment. And I'm very pleased he's not here to see it. Unfortunately, I am, because I go to the boathouse a great deal. I visit them whenever I can, but this will definitely put me off.
And she has some harsh words for developer Eric Eynon himself.
I feel that a man in his 70s shouldn't be behaving like a teenage vandal.
Well, we don't agree with that. There are vandals around there, but I'm not one of them.
I hope he falls over one of his JCBs and ends up at the bottom of the hole that he has created under the cliff. And I'm not usually a vindictive person, but I don't think, unfortunately, that this will happen. And secondly, I don't think it would resolve the situation. But that's how strongly I feel.
Well, she's entitled to her opinion, you know, but I mean, she does tend to offer her opinions quite often on these subjects. But, you know, that really doesn't worry me one bit.
And are you surprised at the kind of...
I think that's rather vindictive. Not that I've ever met the lady. No, totally over the top.
Today, the row still rumbles on. Meanwhile, the work continues on the Ferry House. Eric Eynon hopes to have his new home built by next spring, complete with extensions at either end. However, we can reveal that Mr. Eynon is considering changing his plans again and demolishing the Ferry House. The council say they won't support such a plan and could prosecute him if he goes ahead without permission.
Most people feel, I think, as I do, angry, angry that not more has been done, appalled at how he has ruined the place. Very sad, too, because it was a sort of poet's corner. But that doesn't cut ice with councillors. They're not into poetry.
It ain't poetic. Whatever else it is, it ain't poetic. One man comes in over a weekend, knowing he wouldn't get permission otherwise, and demolishes things. You've got a barbarian at work, an ice cream selling barbarian.
But Eric Eynon is in fact a fan of Dylan Thomas. In the 1950s, he even shared a drink with the poet after being introduced by his father.
So I think he's a fantastic poet, and I have great respect for his poetry.
And some of the people who've spoken to us say that what you're doing is going against what's written in the poetry, disturbing the peace and tranquility of life.
Well, I'm afraid, you know, you can't make omelettes without breaking eggs, and unfortunately we can't do very much about that in the short term, but it hasn't been helped by some of the objections that have been made by some of the people that are against this development.
I would say to Eric to go back and read one of the poems, for example, Over Sir John's Hill, and ponder what he is trying to ruin.
This timeless, balmy, both spelling, town of herons, cormorants, castle, churchyard, girls, ghosts, geese, feuds, scares, scandals, mysteries, bats in the belfry, skeletons in the cupboard, pubs, mud, cockles, flatfish, curlews, rain, and human, often all too human beings. Here we just are, and there is nowhere like it, anywhere at all.